Before that, here on BBC Radio 4, in Revealing the Mindbender General, James Moore investigates the work of one of the most controversial post-war medical psychiatrists, how his former patients still suffer today, and the potentially disastrous consequences of his work.
Across the River Thames, just over there, the Houses of Parliament. But the buildings I'm interested in are just nearby. The Ministry of Defence, and further down the river, the headquarters of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. And behind me is the world-famous St Thomas's Hospital. All of these sites are linked by one man, Dr. William Walters Sargant. 20 years after his death, he remains one of the most controversial figures in psychiatry. Sargant said of himself, "Some say I'm a wonderful doctor. Others, that I'm the work of the devil."
I can't remember being in primary school. I can't really remember much about secondary school. Can't remember the birth of my kids. Certainly, I've lost all those memories that most people have.
So more than 30 years later, you still can't remember your childhood, your training, the birth of your own children?
Not really, no.
That was Dr. Anne White, one of Sargant's patients, who claims she's still suffering the consequences of his treatment. June, who wishes to remain anonymous, says she also suffered a similar experience.
My husband said I was like a zombie. My brother said I was like a zombie. And my husband would have killed him if he could have done.
Although her memory is patchy, she does remember what Dr. Sargant looked like.
His face is etched in my memory. I could never forget it. He was a handsome man and leonine, and a very, very arrogant manner. He didn't discuss things with you. He told you, he talked at you, but he didn't really listen to what you might have to say. In fact, I can't ever remember saying anything to him much.
In the late 60s, the politician Lord Owen was just plain Dr. David Owen when he worked under Sargant as his neurology registrar.
I mean, he was a great big bull of a man, and not for nothing had he played rugby for St Mary's Hospital. He was a presence, you know. You didn't go into a room where Sargant was without noticing him. I've met some extraordinary people in my life, but he goes high up on the list.
I do remember that nobody dared to be in the department without tie.
Another colleague was psychiatrist Professor Parviz Partovi-Tabar, who also found Sargant an imposing figure.
One of the registrars came without tie, and as soon as Dr. Sargant appeared, that registrar ran away and jumped into a room so that Dr. Sargant don't see him.
Ironically, Sargant admitted to suffering from depression himself.
There was days that he was very active, proactive, communicative, but there was days that he was rather sort of introverted and into himself.
What was your professional opinion in observing that in your boss?
Now thinking about how William Sargant was acting in those days, I think the possibility of bipolar affective type 2 was in his case. And he did mention to me on a couple of occasions that he has had very severe depressions in the past, which indicate the possibility of bipolar affective type 2.
My uncle used to keep 2 or 3 mental patients under private care as a doctor. And I saw one of these patients who hadn't talked for 5 years, and I went along and put my tongue out at one of these patients, and for the first time she talked for 5 years. Now there are all sorts of means of showing individual interest in the patient and getting a result, you see. This is very interesting.
That was Dr. Sargant talking in a 1967 BBC radio programme, Experiments with a Mute Schizophrenic. Dr. Sargant became an advocate of using drugs to treat psychiatric disorders rather than the psychoanalytical techniques which were popular at the time. During World War II, he established a psychiatric unit at the Belmont Hospital in Surrey, treating shell-shocked servicemen. There, he was able to put his theories into practice.
We were working on the value of injecting certain drugs into the veins or letting them be inhaled through a face mask to make the patient relive the experience which caused his breakdown. Often terrifying events had been mentally repressed, and their memory would be brought up to the surface again.
Sargant's own words from his 1967 autobiography, The Unquiet Mind. In his meticulously researched book, Brainwash, author Dominic Streatfeild recently lifted the lid on the secret world of psychological experiments, where Sargant features prominently.
In June 1940, he was faced with evacuees from Dunkirk. He didn't know what to do with them. Nobody knew what to do with them because this kind of shell shock had not been seen since the First World War. And he had one particularly sad patient who hadn't urinated for 3 days, was in a dreadful state, mute, shaking, just broken. And Sargant said, I just didn't know what to do with this guy. So I gave him an injection of barbiturates to try and calm him down. And the immediate react was that the guy emptied his bladder all over the sofa, ran around screaming, reliving the trauma that led him into this particularly sad state.
In Sargant's autobiography, he explained his radical use of abreaction, in which he used drugs and terror to treat men returning from Dunkirk.
We might excitedly tell a member of the Royal Tank Corps who had broken down in battle that he was trapped in his burning tank and must fight his way out. Though the situation had not, in fact, occurred to him, the fear that it might do so might have dominated his mind for months. If we could raise the crescendo of a patient's outburst to a grand finale of rage or terror, a state of temporary emotional collapse might follow. He would often and suddenly fall inertly back in bed, exhausted by his emotional discharge.
30 years later, Sargant was still using his abreaction techniques, as his then young registrar, Dr. David Owen, remembers.
There was a patient, which I remember very vividly, who had been in Dunkirk and had been swimming out to the boats, and a German pilot had come down low and shot these people swimming. And you had to relive for this patient this experience. So you would actually theatrically talk to them as they were going in a sort of hazy, phasey way. You say, now the Germans are coming, you can hear the thing, and you'd excite them. And then suddenly they would relive the experience. And in this particular man, very nearly drowned, I once did a tape recording of it. You'd hear him drown. It was quite extraordinary. The noises and the whole thing of somebody drowning. And then having gone through that, they would go to sleep for about 5 minutes or something like that, and then they would walk out quite normally. And they would come back for this periodic abreaction.
Sargant was very excited by what he found with abreaction, and he thought he had discovered something genuinely new, and he immediately published it in The Lancet. Very interesting, 1940, this is cutting edge, and Sargant is making his name. Almost immediately after publishing in The Lancet, Sargant is contacted by the War Office and told in no uncertain terms, do not publish anything about this again. And at that point, it seems that a relationship was struck between William Sargant and Whitehall, the military, and possibly the intelligence organisations.
Sargant was regarded as a leading expert on brainwashing, and his book, Battle for the Mind, became a key reference book on the subject. This was the time of the Korean War, and the military wanted to know more about the potential of these new mind-bending drugs, especially the recently discovered LSD. Experiments began in the US and in Britain using the services of psychiatrists. But did Sargant have a more direct role with the military? A clue lies in a recent court case brought against the MOD in 2008, which revealed that psychiatrists were working at the Secret Weapons Research Establishment at Porton Down. One of the people who brought that case was Don Webb, an ex-serviceman who was given LSD there in 1953.
Do you know the famous Dali melting clock?
Yes, the drippy clock.
Yeah, well, I saw it years later, and I realised that that's exactly what happened to people's faces. The eyes elongated, and sometimes you'd think that the skin had peeled from the face until you could see the skull underneath the skin and the flesh. And that went on for quite a long time. The man who was asking the questions, the bloke who'd conducted the original questionnaire, came back in and asked us, very interested, very authoritative manner, very saying this is quite normal, it's not going to hurt you, it's just some effects we're trying to find out about, and don't worry about it, you're quite safe, there's nothing to worry about. At the same time, he's saying this to me, and he looks like something out of a nightmare.
We showed Don a video of Dr. Sargant to see if he could identify him as the psychiatrist who was in charge.
It could well have been him. The way he held himself, it could very easily have been the same man. Very easily.
And do you feel that the psychiatrists there at Porton were culpable?
The person I was engaged with mostly was the man who was, so far as I could see, the psychiatrist. He was in charge of the entire thing. I would blame him if it was the same man. He was in charge of it. He was running the whole thing.
With no conclusive evidence that it was indeed Sargant, I contacted Portendown to establish whether or not he had worked there.
We can only say that he definitely wasn't directly employed by us.
Their use of the word directly is ambiguous. It could mean he wasn't there at all, or it could mean he was there but was employed by someone else. Someone like MI6, perhaps. I put this to David Owen, who, as Foreign Secretary in the 1970s, was ultimate head of MI6.
When he wrote Battle for Mind, he got him very much involved in brainwashing techniques and things like that, and became probably pretty interested in it. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he was speaking to people who had been on the fringe of brainwashing. I mean, it's quite likely.
So there's every possibility that Sargant was involved with MI6, but is there any evidence that he was experimenting with LSD for the military? The only clue that we can find is buried in his personal papers held in the Wellcome Institute. In particular, the correspondence he had with his close friend, the poet and author Robert Graves. Graves describes in great detail what happened when he took the drug psilocybin, better known as magic mushrooms. Dominic Streetfield takes up the story.
Sargant just lapped it up without a doubt, but the only response we have from Sargant related to hallucinogenic drugs is rather cryptic, and he says, yes, that's all very interesting. There's some quite interesting work going on in the UK with relation to LSD at the moment. And either Sargant didn't write any more about that, which I doubt, or those documents have been taken away from his archive.
In his autobiography, Sargant talks about being privy to secrets at the highest level, and ponders what he should do with them.
Secret information obtained rarely leaks out. Most of us are expected to leave instructions that, when we die, all our notes will be destroyed. Perhaps it should be the duty of those who possess explosive secret information to ensure, at least, that the record does not die with them.
Clearly, Sargant was privy to secrets, but there are still gaps in our knowledge concerning his work with the secret services. What is much clearer, and possibly more disturbing, is the work he was undertaking with ordinary members of the public while working for the NHS. On the creation of the National Health Service in 1948, William Sargant was appointed head of psychiatry at St Thomas's Hospital in London. Here, he describes his arrival at his new department.
Originally a bed store, it had been cleared out during the Blitz for emergency use as an air raid shelter. Dark, dank basement, nicknamed Scutari after the dismal quarters in the Crimean War of Florence Nightingale, who founded modern nursing here at St Thomas's. Patients on low truckle beds were now getting electric shock treatment there. Though, when they woke, confused from their fits, they might sometimes see live rats running along the water pipes, which made them fear that severe mental depression had at last turned into real hallucinatory madness.
St Thomas's had merged with the nearby Royal Waterloo Hospital, and it was there that Sargant custom-built his psychiatric inpatients department, known as Ward 5, or the sleep room. And it was in this ward that he developed his controversial continuous narcosis, or deep sleep treatment. Sargant kept his patients asleep for weeks on end, using a cocktail of drugs and regular bouts of electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT.
Okay, gentlemen. Right. The place you want to see, the call before, they are a studio.
The Royal Waterloo closed in the 1980s and is now the London campus of an American university. I went there to see for myself what was left of his department, and the caretaker, Raoul, took me up the 5 flights of stairs to the sleep room. So this would have been the old ward?
Yes.
Right. Looking out of the windows here, there's where was the old roof garden, quite a small garden, railings around it, although the railings are intermittent, and there's just a 12-inch wall between here and a 60-foot drop down to the street below. I spoke to one of the former patients of Ward 5 here, June.
I can remember the actual room I was in. It was very dimly lit, and they were just like bodies in the bed that were asleep all the time, and I was one of them. I can remember being woken up for meals. One of the drugs that springs to mind is one that I recognised as a truth drug. With my nursing background, I was familiar with the names of drugs. And I remember thinking at the time, why is he using a truth drug? It could have been sodium pentothal, or it could have been sodium amytal, one of those two. I'm not sure. There was a lot of things Dr. Sargant did that were never clearly explained.
Because of a bitter argument June was having with her parents, she says she was admitted to the Waterloo suffering from anxiety attacks, where she was kept asleep for weeks on end and given electroconvulsive therapy.
I can remember having ECT and rubbing my temples and feeling the sort of salty bit where they put the electrodes on either side of my head. And I can remember waking up after ECT, after a dose of ECT, and feeling absolutely terrified, complete, utter terror, because I didn't even know who I was or what my name was. And I recall one of the nurses saying, "No, don't worry about that, because it will come back, your memory will come back, and quite quickly." But I still didn't really understand why I was there and what I had done to be put there and when I would get out. And I remember being very scared that I couldn't see an end to my time. I couldn't see the end of my stay there. And that was really very frightening.
June believes she was in the sleep room for 3 months, although she only has the word of her friends and family to corroborate this. But her experiences are far from unique. Dr. Anne White was another Ward 5 patient. She is now a professor of medicine working abroad. I spoke to her down the line about her experiences in the sleep room.
I was put into a room with, I think, 3 other people. It was dark. I was given massive amounts of drugs to try and keep me asleep, something like chlorpromazine. We were woken up, and I really, you have to believe, I don't remember so clearly exactly what happened, but they woke us up, and I can remember being made to drink a jug of water. I don't remember eating at all, but I do remember after some time, every time I stood up, I just about passed out because my blood pressure was down in my boots, which is actually a function of chlorpromazine as well. And I have no idea exactly how long I was in there, but it took me nearly 3 months to get over the treatment. My father was absolutely shattered when he saw me. He said I just looked like a walking zombie.
Now, before this sleep treatment began, did psychiatrists come and see you and explain to you the nature of this treatment?
No, there was no informed consent at all. I was told that while you were asleep, they were hoping to repattern, and that was actually the word that was used, repattern your thinking so that you lose all the negative depressive thoughts. And in fact, it did wipe my brain clean of just about everything that happened before that.
But it wasn't only the patients who had concerns. Members of his own profession did as well. Malcolm Lader, now Professor of Clinical Psychopharmacology at the Institute of Psychiatry, was invited by Sargant to observe his treatment in Ward 5.
To be quite frank, I was horrified by what I saw. Here were people who were being kept deeply asleep for weeks on end. First of all, you physically smelt all these people who had been lying in bed for days and weeks on end. I'm sure that they did what they could for the hygiene, but it's not an easy thing to do. They were all in this darkened room, and they were just being kept deeply asleep. Occasionally they would be woken up, presumably to go to the lavatories there. But there was no actual therapy being given. But on top of that, they were given courses of electroconvulsive therapy. And those courses were, I think, far beyond the normal length that most psychiatrists at that time were advocating. That, I think, is where my main criticism lies.
After hearing Professor Lader's concerns, I asked Sargant's former registrar, Dr. Partovi Tabar, if the treatment he was overseeing for Sargant was safe.
Everybody have not been able to cope with it, and there have been some who have had skin problems or dehydration. We had to stop. But those who have been continuing with it for 4 weeks, when they have been waking up, they have been totally different, and the obsessive-compulsive disorder was totally gone.
He said himself in an interview that some people thought he was a wonderful doctor, other people thought he was the son of the devil. Where does his reputation stand today?
Well, unfortunately, today nobody knows anything about William Sargant. I went to the hospital library to find Dr. Sargant's book, and there wasn't any book of Dr. Sargant there in the library.
He had his critics, as you well know. I mean, they were in the medical profession that would say that he was taking risks which were quite unjustified and that sort of thing. He'd say, yes, I am. He would weigh in and say, we don't think anything about treating somebody for a heart condition with tablets which may damage them. We do that as a normal thing. You must allow psychiatrists to do the same.
Lord Owen and Dr. Partovi Tabar still defend Sargant and his work to this day. In fact, the Royal College of Surgeons also support his work. They told us that, although his reputation has declined, his work was of great importance in the biological treatment of depression, and the development of antidepressants comes directly from his work. But Sargant also has his critics, and Professor Leder says that taking risks is one thing, but it should have been backed up with proper scientific rigour.
There was no hint, as far as I was aware, that in the St Thomas's setup that there was any attempt to properly assess the treatments. It was a series of one-off individual case reports, and that is not scientific evidence. And the problem is that his reputation was such that people were blindly following these dangerous practices.
In fact, Sargant's deep sleep treatment was being replicated in hospitals on the other side of the globe. At the Allen Institute in Canada, deep sleep was conducted by a Dr. Ewan Cameron. There, former patients succeeded in winning compensation in court, proving that their memories had been irrevocably erased. At the Chelmsford Clinic in Sydney, Australia, Dr. Harry Bailey was also using deep sleep as a treatment. Bailey was a disciple and vied with Sargant to see who could keep their patients asleep for the longest. But tragically, this high-risk game resulted in some of Bailey's patients never waking up. Former Australian lawyer Brian Bromberger, now a Dean of Law in New Orleans, took up the case for those who had survived their ordeal at the Chelmsford Clinic. I asked him how many had died under Bailey's care.
As best we know, there were somewhere between 20 and 25.
And they died as a direct result of the deep sleep treatment?
Yes, yes.
Were you aware of similar treatments taking place in London?
Not at that time, not until we started doing our homework, and that Dr. Harry Bailey's work was exactly the same as Dr. Sargant, who Bailey had met in London in 1955.
After the scandal in Australia became known, Bailey was charged and Sargant was called up to testify. But in a letter outlining his thoughts, he admitted that patients had also died in his care. Dean Brian Bromberger had a copy of that letter, and he read it to me.
If I had come over to Australia to give evidence on oath, I would have had to have said that the technique used by Dr. Bailey in feeding his patients through a stomach tube and not waking them to take 3 full meals and fluid each day was what had resulted in the death of my earlier patients. In fact, I should have found myself supporting the prosecution and not the defence.
So, Sargant's admitting in that letter that some of his patients had also died earlier on through this treatment?
Well, it seems to be, that clearly seems to be the case, yep.
Bailey took his own life a day later, citing Sargant in his suicide note. But who were the people who had died under Sargant's care? How did they die? Some evidence still exists in the archive held at the Wellcome Institute. Sargant himself noted the following.
Out of the 679 treatments on 484 patients, 4 patients developed withdrawal fits and died. Patient 1, acute hemorrhagic enterocolitis after 6 weeks narcosis. Patient 2, after a 14-day period, developed peritonitis with complicating colitis. Patient 3, inhaled vomit after constipation. And patient 4 suffered analytic ileus in the 5th week.
There are no dates and no names given, but it seems reasonable to assume from the period the papers were written that the deaths took place in Ward 5 at the Royal Waterloo Hospital, which at that time was part of the St Thomas's Hospital group. I contacted St Thomas's to see if they could throw any light on Sargant and the consequences of his treatment.
We don't keep medical records past 10 years unless they are cancer patients or for paediatrics. In this case, the doctor worked for the Royal Waterloo Hospital, which then became part of the St Thomas Hospital Group, which then became part of our trust. But the Department of Psychology became part of South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust.
Similarly, the South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust responded,
"We have no records dating back to the time of Dr. William Sargant at St Thomas's Hospital."
The papers relating to Sargant's work were destroyed, so his former patients have no record of their treatment. As soon as Sargant retired in 1972, his sleep treatment ward was immediately closed and converted into a television room. Speaking about his life and work in the last interview he gave before he died in 1988, he said about his work, "I suppose this horrifies people today." Lawyer Alan Kerr would agree. He is the man who won compensation for the men at Porton Down and believes Sargant's sleep room patients should also be compensated.
My understanding from Anne's case is that consent wasn't obtained. The gold standard for consent remains, in my view, the same as it's always been, which is the Nuremberg Code, which is the consent of the individual is absolutely essential. I would hope and anticipate that damages would be paid to those individuals to compensate them from what they went through.
However, Alan Kerr thinks after all these years it will be difficult for anyone who claims to have suffered in Ward 5 to succeed in court. In Australia, there was a royal commission. In Canada, patients won compensation in the courts. The men from Porton Down were also compensated. But after more than 30 years, the patients of Ward 5, like Anne and June, have received no recognition for the suffering that they claim. June says she has only recently come to terms with what happened to her. She says she doesn't want to go to court. She just hopes that in finally telling her story, it may help others who have also suffered in silence.
I would like to feel that other people who had been through the sleep room could feel that they could acknowledge that it happened to them and feel that they could talk about it and not be shy and not be maybe ashamed of it, because I felt for a long time that I didn't want to own up to it, and it made me upset to even try to talk about it. I really couldn't talk about it because I would end up in tears. But I do feel now that I've laid the ghost. So I would just like other people to feel that they can put it away for good. That's all. I don't really want any other kind of outcome.
Revealing the Mindbender General was presented by James Moore. The reader was Philip Fox, and the programme was produced by Neil George.